Today we're talking about three teams and some potential moves we might see here during the offseason or into the early part of next season. We're once again going to be taking a look at the Tampa Bay Lightning. Might they possibly go after a contract that's on long-term injury reserve to kind of maximize their potential flexibility that they're looking for? We're also going to be taking a look at the Anaheim Ducks and the Boston Bruins. We'll discuss all the latest moves coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things to talk about here today. Obviously, we're kind of getting to that point where there's not a lot of active news. The rumor mill's kind of slowing down a little bit, but there's certainly some teams that are kind of forced to be active here still and finding some trades because they need to become cap compliant whenever we're going to have an NHL season. And we'll kick things off again here with the Tampa Bay Lightning, who are one of the teams most talked about throughout the offseason because of their predicament of having the three RFAs, now down to two that remain unsigned. Of course, we saw them sign Sergachev. They still got to get Cirelli and Cernak under contract, but we've seen a lot more comments from GM Julien BriseBois to kind of give us more of an indication on their potential direction. And we also have another article that I came across with some suggestions. This was only a suggestion. I can't say that for sure they're working on this, but it's an idea that would work. And of course, it links them to the Detroit Red Wings and Steve Yzerman, which is not a huge surprise. And of course, that was another link that kind of came up before in the offseason, suggesting that Tampa and Detroit could make some moves to help the Lightning out of the jam. Of course, the Lightning and Red Wings are in very different places. And of course, the two GMs go way back, and of course Yzerman built a lot of the Lightning success that we're now seeing with the Stanley Cup champion. So to kind of go through this a little bit further, we'll first look at the comments here from BriseBois, where he basically alluded to the media that not signing the RFAs and trading them was really never something he wanted to consider. He values them too much, sees them to be too much of a big part of the future to trade out, which I've said numerous times. If they can't find deals for other players because of all the no trade clauses, they may not have a choice to become cap compliant. But of course, I agree, it's not something he would want to do. And of course, he indicated as well that Anthony Cirelli now is a top priority for them to get under contract. And I'm sure that he'll find a way to get it done. But it's going to have to require some patience here, and it's going to have to require, obviously, some creativity. Now, of course, one thing that we could see would be a potential trade to acquire a long-term injury reserve contract. So, for example, look at this as a possibility. We know that Tyler Johnson is a player that the Lightning have been trying to move. He's gone through waivers, we went unclaimed, making $5 million for a few more seasons. Of course, he would be a player that Yzerman's very familiar with, and even though Johnson's value is not quite where it used to be a few years ago, he's still a player that in a lineup with the Red Wings, he could still be a pretty valuable piece there. They don't have a ton of depth down the middle. Of course, Johnson sometimes can play the wing as well, depending on where he's at in the lineup, but clearly I think he'd be more of an asset there in Detroit. And Detroit could also choose to expose him in the expansion draft next year to Seattle. If they want to protect some other younger pieces with their roster and make him available, maybe talk to the Kraken about taking him off their hands, maybe that's something they can possibly work out. But if you see a scenario here, the Red Wings have their captain, Henrik Zetterberg, who we know for sure is not playing again. He's all but retired officially. We've known that for quite some time now that his playing days are over, but he still has another year on his contract. So that could be placed on long-term injury reserve and give a team some flexibility. Now, the Red Wings are a team that's nowhere near the cap. They don't have a cap problem like some teams like the Lightning do, so they could afford to trade that contract. They don't need to be going into LTIR relief with the position that they're in. So could we see a scenario where the Lightning trade Tyler Johnson or possibly one of his teammates? It doesn't have to be Johnson, but Johnson would probably be their preferred player. Or we could even be looking at a guy like an Alex Killorn, for example. Killorn's one of the few players that has a modified no-trade, so there's more flexibility to trade him without his consent. So there's that as well. So we could see a guy like Killorn or even a Yanni Gourde or Andre Palat. I'm not sure how hard of a bargain Yzerman would push for here with the Lightning and Julien BriseBois. I think Palat would be a guy they probably would push to keep because he does play an important role often on that top line, and I know they really like what Yanni Gourde brings as well. I think they'd trade Gourde before Palat, but really at the end of the day, I think Johnson or Killorn will be the primary ones to go here, given where they slot in the lineup, and of course looking at their age, contracts, long-term future, and factoring in all that kind of stuff. So Obviously, the Lightning, if they move out like a $5 million contract, that gives them the flexibility as well that they need. And then they take on a contract like Zetterberg that they could put on long-term injury reserve. They could kind of do what we saw the Leafs do last year and end up overspending. Basically, it's almost a loophole in a way to kind of go over the cap. But you have to have your math just right so that you can maximize what kind of relief you can get. But clearly, moving out $5 million would be pretty well, to the point where they could come close to getting Cirelli and Chernak signed. Chernak's not going to be overly expensive. I'm not sure exactly what we're going to see Cirelli sign for, but we saw Sergachev sign for $4.8 million in 3 years. The Lightning have done a really good job of getting their players to take pretty decent bridge contracts. I mean, we've seen Stamkos do it. We saw Hedman do it. We saw Kucherov do it. Braden Point got one done last year. Obviously Sergachev just got one done. So obviously, on a 3-year deal, which is probably what they'd like to see do, maybe even in 2 years. I can't see them going 4. Obviously, 4 years would put them right to free agency. So if they're going to go 4 or more, they're going to go 5, 6, or 7. But they very well will. I think more likely would probably want to do the 2 or 3 year deal would be preferable. They kind of want to also stagger what players are available at what year, what offseason, so they don't have too much coming up at one time. That's obviously another priority here for most GMs around the NHL. So if they can get him signed, say somewhere around that $4 million mark, that obviously moving out $5 million gives them enough room to do that. But they're already over as it is, so they need a little bit more than that. So they kind of would have to move out 2 contracts, and it's difficult to say who that second player would be. But if they take in an LTIR contract instead, then they could put that on a long-term injury reserve, and it could help them keep an additional player in the lineup. I mean, it's only 1 year left on Zetterberg. I mean, that's just an example. It doesn't mean it would be him. There are other players around the league that could be considered for that as well. But given the link to Detroit and Yzerman and the history, and like I said, we had rumors before in the offseason that they were going to be making a trade between Tampa and Detroit, and that there was some speculation that Detroit might take on a player for them and then trade them back later with some retained salary. Now, we didn't see a trade take place yet, so at this point we can't say that's going to happen, but there was some talk about that before. So I guess we'll see. This would be almost an easier way of doing it that would cause a lot less questions from other teams and fans. So obviously, let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think the Lightning here would end up playing a card similar to what the Leafs did last year? Take on a contract for long-term injury reserve that's going to let them go over. And that way they might only have to trade out 1 contract instead of 2 to become cap compliant and get everything here in order. And does it make sense that their old boss like Steve Yzerman in Detroit would be one of the prime teams we'd probably see them talking to? Now, there's also additional talk here as well on Ryan Getzlaf's future with the Anaheim Ducks. Now, he's a player we talked about not too long ago. I think somewhere in the last week or two, we mentioned there was some talk that he could possibly find himself moved. Obviously, he's got 1 year left on his contract. We've seen the Ducks really start to somewhat go through a bit of a retool or a rebuild here. We saw his longtime teammate, Corey Perry, get bought out. Obviously, he played last year with the Dallas Stars. And it's just a matter of question here, is his time going to be coming to an end as well? Or will they find a way to retain their captain a little bit longer once his contract's up? Do they maybe consider re-signing him on a shorter-term, cheaper contract? Obviously, I think Getzlaf hasn't quite fallen off to the extent that Perry did. His contract was really looking bad because his production had really plummeted. But Ryan Getzlaf, even though he's not really an $8 million player anymore, he's certainly not gone down to the point where we saw Corey Perry do either. So he's certainly more valuable keeping around. A good leader, good center iceman. And they could decide to go down that route. But if Bob Murray takes this team deeper into a rebuild, and I think we'll know the answer to that probably fairly early into the upcoming season. The first 15-20 games is going to be a good test for them to see really where they stand. Have they really made much progress? Can they be anywhere near the playoffs, or should they go a little bit deeper onto the turnover of this team and they obviously continue moving out some assets to get younger and faster, more skilled, and keep going through that route, because they've done a pretty good job. They get some really good prospects here in their organization now. And they also have some young players that are already just in the early stages of their entry-level deals, plus what's recently drafted here that are still hasn't made their NHL debut. So the Ducks are in a situation where they have a lot of young pieces that are really interesting, and they could see some big improvements in the next few years. So it's a matter of, do they want to keep a guy like Getzlaf around or not? I mean, I would think that looking around the NHL, I know the article I was referencing here discusses the possibility of teams like the Bruins or the Flyers or even the Penguins, if they're in the playoff hunt like they're expected to be for the coming season, and the Ducks aren't, which also wouldn't be surprising, that a player like Ryan Getzlaf could very well be an excellent trade chip at the deadline. And it doesn't even mean that his future with Anaheim at that point is over. Anaheim very well could trade him as a deadline piece to one of the contending teams. He could go have a chance to chase the Stanley Cup. And then if they wanted to work it out, he could always go back and re-sign with Anaheim in the offseason. That's certainly a possibility that we could see. Obviously, those teams would be some prime examples of teams that would be interested in a player like that to add some even more depth and get a nice veteran on there to help them chase another Stanley Cup. So I guess we'll see what happens, but let me know what your thoughts are on the future of Ryan Getzlaf. We've seen numerous reports now in the past couple of weeks talking about how his future could be coming to an end and what his future might hold as captain of the Ducks. Now, lastly, I want to touch on the Boston Bruins. Now, there are reports that we very well might see them extend David Krejci. Now, there's also some talk that maybe his time will come to an end and he'll be moved out as a potential trade during the coming season. Of course, the Bruins are in a spot where we don't really know what to expect this year because they have some uncertainty. We've seen some big losses on the blue line. We don't know if Captain Zdeno Chara's coming back. We saw Torrey Krug leave town. Up front, I know Pasternak and Marchand both went through some serious injuries. Marchand, I think, was going to be on time to start the season. Pasternak, I'm not sure. I haven't heard an update on him in a little while. But still, they're also at a stage where the goaltenders are another year older, near the end of their contracts. Krejci's going into the final year of his deal as well. And, could we see a scenario where the Bruins might not quite be so competitive this year? Don Sweeney hasn't really done much in a way to really change the team or really add much of anything after a disappointing 2020 playoffs. With a quiet offseason in Boston, it's certainly debatable what their future holds. So, but there is talk that Krejci could be looking at maybe a 2 to 3 year contract to kind of allow him to retire as a Bruin, kind of right out his final days here. Obviously, be less money. Right now, he's the highest paid Bruin at $7.25 million. There's a talk that it could be somewhere around that $5 million mark. And one reason I think it's more likely than not that he very well could stay and sign a short extension would be that they don't really have somebody there that's primed and ready to take over that number 2 center spot. I mean, outside of Patrice Bergeron, they're pretty weak down the middle if Krejci is not there. So that is a problem. They haven't had the greatest, number 3, number 4 centers here in the last little while. And it's not an area of strength for the Boston Bruins. So at this point, they have to kind of weigh their losses here and say, if we don't re-sign Krejci, as much as they'd like to have that flexibility from a cap perspective, who's going to take over? And there's really not a lot of options. So I think it's pretty unlikely that Krejci would be traded. It's pretty likely that both teams can agree on a new contract, that we do see Krejci sign a short-term extension for a couple more years and end up riding out his time here and retiring as a Boston Bruin. So let me know your thoughts on the Bruins as well. I know they've been kind of rumored in a lot of different scenarios as well. We don't know what they're doing, if they're going to replace anything on the blue line. Are they going after Mike Hoffman? Is Krejci going to sign an extension? Lots of talk around Boston. They've been one of the other teams along with Tampa that have been really in the rumor mill substantially here in the past few weeks. But right now we have more rumors and more questions than we do answers for Boston. So it's unclear how Sweeney and company are going to proceed. So let me know your thoughts on everything discussed here today down in the comments, and we'll discuss further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.